So the Constitutional Convention, after it gets called because of Shays' Rebellion and the numerous other problems that we see happening with the inability to control trade, the dilemmas between the different states, you're going to have, and it's really, you also have, and this is kind of a lesser known fact, that you have this attempt to have essentially a canal project put in Virginia. And that's going to be stymied by competition between Virginia and Maryland. And that the result of that is going to be that men like Washington are going to get upset. And they're going to decide that, you know what, we need to do something. So you're going to have 55 delegates from all the different states come. It's also important to note that the Constitutional Convention is largely held in secret. It's not that people didn't know they were having it. But the procedures, the process was held behind closed doors. So when people get mad about the idea about, oh, well, hey, it's not constitutional for policy to be made behind closed doors. Well, the original Constitution was made behind closed doors. I don't know that that justifies it, but you certainly see that that was the case. Rhode Island gets stubborn. They refuse to participate. But the others come to the meeting. Of course, Rhode Island, if you go with the Articles of Confederation, that should mean that this attempt to amend the Articles is DOA. Except we're going to find out that that's not the case. George Washington is made the president. Madison works really hard to convince Washington that he needs to be there, that his presence will lend an air of authority to it. Thomas Jefferson, who's overseas in France, and John Adams is over in Great Britain. And you're going to have a lot of these young, well-to-do guys. Again, these are wealthy individuals, the merchants, the planters, the lawyers, and they're going to go to this Constitutional Convention. James Madison, I think I've mentioned before, is the primary framer of the Constitution. He's the one that studies multiple samples of constitutions from around the world and makes this conclusion about the fact that, how to create a democratic system. And he becomes convinced that republics are not very successful, certainly not successful if they get very big. And so his concern is that the country is too big for a true Republican government. And his example is going to be the Articles of Confederation. Most of the guys there are recognizing the need for a stronger central government, but the question is, how exactly is that supposed to look? Like, is a strong central government supposed to be that Congress can control trade? Is a strong central government supposed to be that Congress can tax? And so a lot of guys will show up thinking they're going to get a stronger central government, but also thinking that essentially that it's going to be the Articles of Confederation. Except Madison comes up with an idea of a whole new thing, right? This has never been done before. This is a national republic. It's essentially divides the government into three branches: an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch. He proposes that the legislative branch will have a lower house that's directly elected and an upper house that's elected by state legislatures, and that both will be divided up according to population. So the more populous states will have more representatives, the less populated states will have fewer representatives, and so and with this system, right, it's meant to kind of have a way of letting more reasoned, disciplined people have a say in the government, as well as letting the popular will of the people prevail. So his idea is called the Virginia Plan. Now, a lot of your small states, a lot of your states that don't have much population, don't like this plan. Because they feel like they're going to not have much representation. So if you take, for instance, Rhode Island, or let's say Georgia or South Carolina, where the number of eligible voters is pretty limited, that's going to mean that they don't have as much say in the government policy. So this is kind of where you get this idea of the republic idea, that states should be able to have a say in what's going on, regardless of how big the state is. The New Jersey plan, is going to give, it basically keeps the articles very similar, gives Congress the power to tax and regulate trade, but creates a single assembly with equal representation. So number of people in your state doesn't matter. And this is why they considered it the small state plan. But many people that had growing populations or had more land than a small state like New Jersey felt like this would not work for them. So this debate between the Virginia plan with its idea that you could have population growth and that population growth would translate to political power versus, say, the New Jersey plan, which said, oh, no, that's not going to happen, leads to a deadlock. And in fact, you can kind of see that today.
You have a return phone call on hold.
Okay. So anyways, so you have this deadlock, and we have this very much the same way today. Why are people frustrated with the results of the 2016 election? Well, states like California and New York voted for Hillary Clinton. And they are populated states, right? And they feel like their populated votes, the contributions of their population of their state to the national economy is being outweighed by states that don't have as much population, don't contribute as much, and that sort of thing. So this is the kind of debate that you see. It does lead to deadlock when you've got two different economic interests, two different cultural interests, and these divisions are essentially leading to this idea that some people are not being adequately represented. And I don't know that there's a good solution to that. I mean, otherwise, the pendulum swings the other way, and people that are in less populated states don't have as much representation. You could make an argument that less populated states, whether it was 1787 or today, that they don't contribute as much. So why should they have so much say? Except sometimes there's policies that profoundly affect them. So I think it's really important for you to kind of understand that this debate about small states versus big states, populated states versus unpopulated states, and this question about how much power should Congress have, and what do we want Congress to look like, and how do we want the composition of Congress to work? These are relevant questions now as well as then. Of course, this is a famous painting about the signing of the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin, who was present, he was pretty elderly by this time, he recommends a compromise where he says the states are represented equally in the upper house, which is the Senate. The House of Representatives is based on population. That stays true until the country gets so big that they limit to 435 representatives. And basically, you have a limit of 435 representatives, and that's why every 10 years they look at the census data and they divide up, how many representatives each state gets. But nowadays we don't go over 435. Of course, back then they didn't worry about that just yet. And the compromise to the lower house was that only they could initiate tax spending. So this is why the House of Representatives is always the one talking about tax bills and the budget and that kind of thing. So the other compromise that Franklin makes is that slaves would count as 3/5 of a person in population total. So states like South Carolina that were worried that their large slave population and smaller white population would mean that they weren't able to protect their economic interests, they are given the compromise of 3/5 of a person. So you have Ben Franklin coming up with a solution that appeases the small states because they'll have equal representation in the Senate, that appeases the populated states because they can control taxation, and appeases the slave-owning states that are concerned about how population will be counted because they allow for slaves to count for 3/5. They also create this electoral college, saying that the electoral college will select the president, and the electoral votes are based on the number of senators and the number of representatives. In other words, they take, okay, how many senators do we have? How many representatives do we have? And that's how many electors we have. And it's the electors that actually choose the president. Now, of course, the way people vote typically shapes today the way the electors vote. This is why people get upset about the Electoral College. They say that it doesn't really represent direct democracy. And that's because it wasn't intended to. Part of this is that in 1789, they didn't consider that it would ever be possible for us to elect, to find out the results overnight. They thought you needed to have time. They also were a little bit concerned about the will of the people. Sometimes people get a little carried away, and so they thought that the electors could kind of serve as a buffer, as well as making allowances for news to travel, right, and for the results of an election to be held. And so this concern about the whims of the majority, this concern about, we want to keep the different states happy, but at the same time, we have to be very careful that we don't give the states too much power. We don't want to give too much power to the popular people because, as in the case of Shays' Rebellion, you can see very quickly how that gets out of hand. And the idea of a republic, right, the 13 republics that we had prior to the Constitutional Convention, those were dominated by popular will, and those were very ineffective. So the Electoral College, for all that we complain about it today, and one could argue that it's a concept that has outlived its time, the Electoral College is the way it is set up initially, and it is intended to protect the will of smaller states, and it is intended to protect and to kind of create a buffer. Now, one can argue that since, in the 21st century, it doesn't work that way. I mean, we've had 2 elections where the popular vote didn't end up with the Electoral College win. 2000 and 2016, the Democratic candidate in both cases had more votes. But the Electoral College came down so that the Republican candidate had the magic number. And so we can argue that maybe the Electoral College isn't as relevant as it once was. But if you live in a state that doesn't have a lot of people in it, a state like, say, Montana, you're going to like the Electoral College because it will represent your interests better. So, I think there's a couple of different ways you can examine the Electoral College. To me, it's a part of the Constitution, and that's just how it is. So keep in mind that this is all a compromise. So it is this compromise that leads to our separation of powers. And one of the things we'll do in class is look at the preamble and kind of talk about that a little bit. But I'm going to go ahead and talk about the different branches. And I'm actually going to verbally tell them in the order in which they appear in the Constitution. So Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch. That's Congress. That's the Senate and the House. And they make laws, they levy taxes, they regulate commerce. They're the ones that have the power to declare war. So Article 1 is the legislative branch. You might need to know that for the STAR test. Article 2 is the executive branch, the president. The president has veto power over the legislature, has command of the army, can nominate judges and nominate executive officials and create those cabinet departments. So the executive branch is intended to have limited authority, right? The legislature is really in charge of governing. The executive branch is just kind of that last check, that last kind of balance in case the legislature gets out of hand or gets difficult, as well as having a single commander of the military. The judicial branch is the third article. Article 3 creates this judicial branch, creates the Supreme Court. It is largely ill-defined in the original Constitution. The Supreme Court's role and the role of the judicial branch as far as judicial review becomes established later through legal precedent. But Article 3 does kind of set out the initial structure of the Supreme Court, but that gets amended later on with the Judiciary Acts and that kind of thing. So the judiciary branch, Article 3, is largely kind of a work in progress. So it is not set in stone in quite the way the legislature or the executive branch is. And it creates very specific limitations on the state legislatures. They cannot print money, so we're going to get control of that currency. They cannot collect trade duties. They cannot create their own tariffs, their own foreign relations. That is under the responsibility of the United States government. So if it's trade that's within a state, the state can control it. But if it has to do with anything outside the state, it falls under the power of Congress. And so understand that that this is really kind of considered a sleight of hand. That the delegates were technically only charged with revising the articles, not with writing a new constitution, but they do so anyways. The delegates had basically started off, of course, remember, Rhode Island doesn't come, so they have to amend this process from the get-go or nothing's going to matter. So they agree that only 9 of the 13 states had to ratify the Constitution, so we don't have this requirement of unanimity. Remember how difficult that was to work with. You also have direct ratification of conventions. So you have direct constitutional conventions, not state legislatures. So the state legislatures won't have any say. Remember, they aren't going to like that they're losing power. And this is where we get this idea of the Constitution and the preamble, which we'll look at in class and kind of talk about. So I'm going to stop this here, and then we'll pick up the last